his relatives away. I felt more cheerful. There are few troubles youth cannot distance with the start of a good night's rest. After a substantial breakfast, prepared by George, in a few moments we were mounted and dashing down the plain. We followed the line of alder that defined the creek, now dry and baked with summer's heat, but which in winter, George told me, overflowed its banks. I still retain a vivid impression of that morning's ride, the far-off mountains like silhouettes against the steel-blue sky, the crisp dry air, and the expanding track before me, animated often by the well-knit figure of George Tryon, musical with jingling spurs and picturesque with flying riata. He rode powerful native roan, wild-eyed, untiring in stride and unbroken in nature. Alas, the curves of beauty were concealed by the cumbrous maquillas of the Spanish saddle, which levels all equine distinctions. The single rein lay loosely on the cruel bit that can gripe, and, if need be, crush the jaw it controls. Again, the illimitable freedom of the valley rises before me, as we again bear down into sunlit space. Can this be Choo-Choo? Staid and respectable filly of American pedigree? Choo-Choo, forgetful of plank roads and cobblestones, wild with excitement, twinkling her small white feet beneath me? George laughs out a cloud of dust. "Give her her head. Don't you see she likes it?" And Choo-Choo seems to like it. And whether bitten by native tarantula into native barbarism, or emulous of the roan, blood asserts itself, and in a moment the peaceful servitude of years is beaten out in the music of her clattering hoofs. The creek widens to a deep gully. We dive into it, and up on the opposite side, carrying a moving cloud of impalpable powder with us. Cattle are scattered over the plain, grazing quietly or banded together in vast restless herds. George makes a wide, indefinite sweep with the riata, as if to include them all in his vaquero's loop, and says, "Ours." "About how many, George?" "Don't know." "How many?" "Well, perhaps 3,000 head," says George, reflecting. "We don't know. Takes 5 men to look 'em up and keep run." "What are they worth?" "About $30 a head." I make a rapid calculation, and look my astonishment at the laughing George. Perhaps a recollection of the domestic economy of the Tryon household is expressed in that look, for George averts his eyes and says apologetically, "I've tried to get the old man to sell and build, but you know he says it ain't no use to settle down, just yet. We must keep movin'. In fact, he built the shanty for that purpose, lest titles should fall through, and we'd have to get up and move stakes further down." Suddenly his quick eye detects some unusual sight in a herd we are passing, and with an exclamation he puts his roan into the center of the mass. I follow, or rather Choo-Choo darts after the roan, and in a few moments we are in the midst of the apparently inextricable horns and hoofs. "Toro!" shouts George with vaquero enthusiasm, and the band opens a way for the swinging riata. I can feel their steaming breaths, and their spume is cast on Choo-Choo's quivering flank. Wild, devilish-looking beasts are they, not such shapes as Jove might have chosen to woo a goddess, nor such as peacefully range the downs of Devon, but lean and hungry Cassius-like bovines, economically got up to meet the exigencies of a 6 months' rainless climate, and accustomed to wrestle with the distracting wind and the blinding dust. "That's not our brand," says George. "They're strange stock." And he points to what my scientific eye recognizes as the astrological sign of Venus, deeply seared in the brown flanks of the bull he is chasing. But the herd are closing round us with low mutterings, and George has again recourse to the authoritative "Toro!" and with swinging riata divides the bossy bucklers on either side. When we are free, and breathing somewhat more easily, I venture to ask George if they ever attack anyone. "Never horsemen, sometimes footmen. Not through rage, you know, but curiosity. They think a man and his horse are one, and if they meet a chap afoot, they run him down and trample him under hoof, in the pursuit of knowledge. But," adds George, "here's the lower bench of the foothills, and here's Altascar's corral, and that white building you see yonder is the casa." A whitewashed wall enclosed a court containing another adobe building, baked with the solar beams of many summers. Leaving our horses in the charge of a few peons in the courtyard, who were basking lazily in the sun, we entered a low doorway, where a deep shadow and an agreeable coolness fell upon us, as sudden and grateful as a plunge in cool water, from its contrast with the external glare and heat. In the center of a low-ceiled apartment sat an old man with a black silk handkerchief tied about his head, the few gray hairs that escaped from its folds relieving his gamboge-colored face. The odor of cigarritos was as incense added to the cathedral gloom of the building. As Senor Altascar rose with well-bred gravity to receive us, George advanced with such a heightened color, and such a blending of tenderness and respect in his manner, that I was touched to the heart by so much devotion in the careless youth. In fact, my eyes were still dazzled by the effect of the outer sunshine, and at first I did not see the white teeth and black eyes of Pepita, who slipped into the corridor as we entered. It was no pleasant matter to disclose particulars of business which would deprive the old senor of the greater part of that land we had just ridden over, and I did it with great embarrassment. But he listened calmly, not a muscle of his dark face stirring, and the smoke curling placidly from his lips showed his regular respiration. When I had finished, he offered quietly to accompany us to the line of demarcation. George had meanwhile disappeared, but a suspicious conversation in broken Spanish and English in the corridor betrayed his vicinity. When he returned again, a little absent-minded, the old man, by far the coolest and most self-possessed of the party, extinguished his black silk cap beneath that stiff, uncomely sombrero which all native Californians affect. A serape thrown over his shoulders hinted that he was waiting. Horses are always ready saddled in Spanish ranchos, and in half an hour from the time of our arrival we were again loping in the staring sunlight. But not as cheerfully as before. George and myself were weighed down by restraint, and Altascar was gravely quiet. To break the silence, and by way of a consolatory essay, I hinted to him that there might be further intervention or appeal, but the proffered oil and wine were returned with a careless shrug of the shoulders and a sententious, "Que bueno! Your courts are always just." The Indian mound of the previous night's discovery was a bearing monument of the new line, and there we halted. We were surprised to find the old man Tryon waiting us. For the first time during our interview, the old Spaniard seemed moved, and the blood rose in his yellow cheek. I was anxious to close the scene, and pointed out the corner boundaries as clearly as my recollection served. "The deputies will be here tomorrow to run the lines from this initial point, and there will be no further trouble, I believe, gentlemen." Senor Altascar had dismounted, and was gathering a few tufts of dried grass in his hands. George and I exchanged glances. He presently arose from his stooping posture, and advancing to within a few paces of Joseph Tryon, said, in a voice broken with passion, "And I, Fernando Jesus Maria Altascar, put you in possession of my land in the fashion of my country." He threw a sod to each of the cardinal points. "I don't know your courts, your judges, or your corregidores. Take the llano, and take these with it. May the drought seize your cattle till their tongues hang down as long as those of your lying lawyers. May it be the curse